Altered Assembly Culture, a competition brief by Shane Cromwell, Rachel Kazmasic, and Ryan Griesler. Altered Assembly Culture looks at the intersection of public space, emerging and changing technologies, social and cultural norms, and how these can reimagine and change what public assembly is. Starting from looking at NAO's or Normal Architecture's Office Stadium Culture Project and what they were researching, including the youth movement in Siberia, the cultural place for sports and gathering, how we can integrate technology, and ultimately what stadium design is. We took these ideas one step further, looking at the social network, what that means for a pandemic, how sports proceed, and how gathering proceeds in this new cultural and social age. Which leads us to our competition brief. How can public space be reimagined to facilitate traditional assembly activities while integrating new technological advances and cultural norms for the public to experience and learn? We started thinking about how one might research this through the lens of 4 design research methods: historic interpretive research, qualitative research methods, research of and by making, and research of architectural performance. Historic interpretive research just wants to look back and understand what assembly means for human culture and how has it changed over time. We can then start to draw conclusions on patterns and variables for gathering that can inform what the design is. For example, we can look at the Roman Forum, which was a huge cultural and social hub in ancient Rome. It hosted many events from social gatherings, religious gatherings, political gatherings, and commerce. We can also look at French salons of the 16th through 18th century. These were large meetings of political, social, and cultural debate, hosted in private residence by one predominant social figure. And we can also look at modern stadium design, which are designed to maximize the amount of people while being flexible spaces, whether it be localized gatherings such as sport, community events, political rallies, but as well as larger cultural events such as concerts, theater, and expositions. So what conclusions can we make? There are certain patterns and variables that can be drawn from this historic precedent research. There's an exchange of social and political and cultural ideals. All these exist within the public realm of society. And there's a reliance on physical human interaction and presence, or a sense of place. There are also variables like the scale of the gathering, or the architectural typology, such as the public square, the private residence, or the large indoor/outdoor theater. We then can look at qualitative research methods. There's a direct connection between the human interaction and its effect on public space. There's a ton of research out there on how human interaction works and how that affects what public space is, the difference between public interaction and private interaction. All of these can start to help unpack and understand what assembly culture means. In the psychology of health and well-being in mass gatherings, it starts to explain how one has a sense of identity, a sense of self, a sense of place when in a large group. And that can be very good and helpful for one's health. We see this a lot in sporting events. But we now know there's some serious and potentially deadly health concerns when it comes to large mass gatherings. And how do we take that into consideration when we think of what assembly culture could be? Reclaiming public space or designing for public interaction with private devices. This paper starts to outline how public space is this place to be seen, this place to interact with others, but with the implementation of this new technology known as the cell phone, it's increasingly becoming this more private and isolated experience. While you might be out in public, your use of your cell phone really isolates you from what the public wants to be. As well as looking at the commercialization of what the public realm is. It also speculates on how this commercialization and how this technology can begin to influence the public in a more interactive method. And lastly, performative interaction in public space. This starts to look at how everything you do in public space is an act of performance. You're constantly being watched. You know you're being watched. But also, it touches on how public space and performance is only effective when there's a spectator as well. And how does this idea of performance translate to these new emerging technologies like virtual reality or even the virtual meetings such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams? All these technologies are becoming commonplace, and we need to understand how this new public place or assembly space correlates to traditional assembly. Research of and by making. The act of making can inform design in ways that simple sketches or discourse cannot. Researching how to integrate old and new, how materials work together, and how common architectural elements create public identity can all be understood more thoroughly through the process of making. Understanding the material quality and how to implement old and new is an ongoing issue in architecture. But when we start talking about the public realm, it becomes even more complicated. How does this new idea of assembly culture start to interact with what we already know as traditional assembly? How can we actively understand and integrate old and new together through the idea of making? There's also common typologies in public space that is persistent throughout architecture. The idea of the boulevard, the public transport street, the pedestrian street. All these have certain material properties. Looking at one space and how simple changes define what that space does. And understanding public in a smaller scale. And finally, research of architectural performance. As architecture and technology evolve and coexist, researching public space through the lens of the digital realm will inform design ideals and allow ideas of assembly to be analyzed with a new understanding. This is kind of a twofold process, involving understanding the existing and informing the new. Understanding the existing. Using technology such as LiDAR 3D scanning can start to bring these existing public spaces into the digital realm. Structures like Notre Dame have been scanned and forever are etched in history, long before the roof burnt down, so we have a document of what this public space is as it stood in that moment of time. Bringing these spaces into the digital realm will not only help designers understand the space better, but can start pushing the envelope of what public space is and how to design it. And informing the new. There are a multitude of architectural technologies out there that we can use to properly design and understand how to create assembly culture. You can use these technologies to better understand sun, rain, wind loads to make sure we are efficiently designing public space that facilitates assembly. We can also use these technologies to map human interaction and typical human movement. So what does that mean for altered assembly culture? Let me remind you of our competition brief. How public space can be reimagined to facilitate traditional assembly activities while integrating new technological advances and cultural norms for the public to experience and learn. Well, we looked at patterns and variables, peoples and processes, products and making, and performance and technology. and how these specific items can be researched and understood in the lens of public space and assembly, and start to inform what a design of reinventing, rethinking, and reimagining what assembly culture may be. Thank you.